this story actually involves Sid's really original expedition. I think it's probably his first expedition abroad, and it revolves around the BBC, and the film was made on an absolute shoestring. And originally, of course, we'd organised this expedition to the Pierre St Martin in France. What would it be? 72, around about 1972. So we're talking a long time ago. And Sid wanted to film it, so he came to see me, and we talked about the plans, what we were going to do. And Sid went to the BBC and put the proposal forward, and they liked the idea. And then on the last minute, they decided they didn't want to make the film. So Sid had invested quite a lot of money and effort in getting this film together, and then they decided they didn't want it. So the expedition actually set off without Sid. And then a few days later, the BBC changed their minds. And so Sid had to go rushing around like a blue bottle, trying to get all the gear together, building lights and this kind of stuff, you know. So he finally got out there with a team. But we'd already been out, I think, about a week when he arrived. And we made this film with the Pierre St Martin. At first, the BBC didn't seem to like it, and said, "Oh, forget it," Sid. Of course, by this time, the expedition finished. So he sent all his men home. And then they got the rushes, and they said, "Oh, this is the best caving film we've seen."
So there were now just 4 of us left, myself and Alison, Donnie and Steve, all pretty pissed off, as you may well imagine. So we drove to the beach at Berwick's for a day or two to drown our sorrows, before we had to make the long drive back to Yorkshire in my mini-motor. We then had to return to Sundergrass to pick up my film equipment. There was a telegram awaiting. The BBC had changed their minds, wanted to go ahead with the film, and were now sending a producer out. Mind-blowing. Go filming down the PSM with 3 cavers, heavy batteries and all that? I desperately contacted England to ask others to come out. We got about 4. The weeks ahead were desperate. The producer was a fish out of water.
He had a terrible time with this producer. They were slaving away. Of course, in those days, they used car batteries, for the lights. And he had a really hard time. Anyway, he finally completed the film, and we got back to the UK. Then I got a call from Sid, and it could have been Sid or the BBC, saying, "We've got a slight problem." And I says, what's that? What's the problem? Well, the story goes that Lepinau was sat on a rock, and he was throwing stones, and a crow flew away, and he thought, crows only nest over a big drop, so there must be a shaft there. So of course Lepinau had gone along and found the entrance to the Pierre St Martin, the Lepinau shaft. So he says, "We haven't got this on film." So he says, the BBC producer says, "Can you find us a shaft a bit like the Lepinau shaft?" And I says, "Well, not in Derbyshire, no." So he says, "Well, you must be able to find something that's similar." And I thought, well, a shake hole will do, because it doesn't really matter, because it was just a guy sat on a rock throwing stones. So I said, "Okay, I'll find something." So in the end, we went up to Axe Edge Moor, in Stanley Moor in Derbyshire. Just grotted little caves, but there's some good shake holes there. So we got there, and the producer opens the back of his car, and he's got 2 sacks in the back of his car with something wriggling inside them. So I says, "What have you got in the sacks?" And he says, "Crows." I said, "Crows? Where the hell did you get crows from?" And he says, "Oh, I went up to Chatsworth Estates, and the gamekeeper caught me 2 sackfuls of crows." So he had about 20 crows in the back of his car. They'd probably been in the back of his car for a couple of days. So I was amazed that they were still alive. So I says, "Right, okay, what's the score? What do you want us to do?" And he says, "Well, you sit on that rock over there, and Sid, you get down that hole with a sack of crows." So I said, all right, that sounds like a good idea. And he says, throw a stone, and when it hits Sid on the head, it lets a crow go. And I said, okay, that sounds fair enough. So I sat on this rock, and Sid got down in the hole with a sack of crows. So he was wearing a helmet, so I threw a stone, hit him on the top of the head, and he opened the sack and let a crow out. Well, the first crow kind of seemed to crawl across the grass for a little bit and then fall up with his feet stuck up in the air. So, cut, start again, okay. So we did another one. Stone, bang on the top of Sid's head. Let another crow go. This one kind of crawled across the grass and then died. Cut, let's try again. So, by this time, Sid's doing his usual laugh, like he does. I can't do it. Anyway, finally, we managed to get a crow that actually flew out of the hole, and he got this shot. Now, this bit of a shot must have cost thousands for what? 2 seconds? 3 seconds? Whereas Sid had done the whole film virtually for next to nothing. The story didn't finish there, you see, because Sid thought, right, he'd signed a contract, like Sid does, very trusting man. And they said, all right, that was how much he got to make the film, and he just about he barely broke even. But on the contract, it said, okay, if we show the film again, then you'll get a percentage. And he thought, well, that's my money, that'd be my profit, my 3 months' wages for working on this film. So then he came and he said, oh, Sid, we've decided not to show it again. And he says, what? He says, you can't do that, it's in the contract. So we can. He says, oh yes, we can, it's too expensive. So Sid was so cheesed off with his film and what had gone on, a total catastrophe. I think he threw it at the back of the fire. And it was never seen again for something like 40 years. It was only shown the once on the TV. I think he was down in the Vaucause, a film festival or something like that, and somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, do you remember me? And he says, no. And he says, well, my name's Ruben Gomez. And Ruben at that time was basically the king of the Pierre St Martin, And he says, and they started talking and chatting, and he says, I still show that film of yours. I said, what film? He says, the film of the Pierre St Martin, 1972. So he said, I didn't know he had a copy. I haven't got a copy. I haven't seen it, he says, for 40 years.
So the next thing you know, this parcel arrives from Rubens containing a 16mm film, which was his original copy. And it was knackered. There were broken sprocket holes, it was scratched to hell, there were bits missing that had been stuck together with bits of tape. It was a complete mess, but I managed to get it together enough to make a rough DVD copy.
But a bit later on, I think he got a good copy, and he did show it at the last conference. It went down a bomb. He told some funny stories, of course, about the films. And that was really Sid's first expedition film. And as I say, it was a catastrophe. But in actual fact, now you look at it, it's got some damn good footage in it of real cavers, hairy cavers, warts and all.
In a cave as cold as the Pierre St Martin, you really can't afford to stop still for a long time, because otherwise your body temperature is going to fall very drastically and you're going to be in trouble. Everybody's got to be doing something.
Making their own heat.
Yeah, making their own heat, yes.
On pitches like these, they lifeline a man down, tie a rope around his body, and pay it out as he descends the ladder so that if he does slip off, or the ladder should break, he still has a chance. Ahead, the advance party have already laddered 3 more pitches, but always in the back of their minds is the thought of the return, of conserving enough energy to climb back up.